communicating with strangers?
His mother, let me assure you, was a very nice woman and a very caring, wholly respectable, good mother. No question about that. And she couldn't have been more concerned for her son at all relevant times, and she couldn't have done more to protect him from whatever dangers a parent, before this case, would think the internet poses. But there's only so much a mother can do.
Neither Mark nor John were put off by warnings from their parents. They continued to communicate with the mysterious Janet Dobinson. On Saturday 28th of June, the day before the stabbing, 16-year-old Mark, now known by his codename 47695, received his final instructions from Janet. Before the weekend was out, his mission would be over. If he could finish the job, Janet said he'd be paid £80 million and rewarded with a career in the intelligence service. But Mark seemed to be more interested in the other benefits of being an accomplished agent. She promised that if he completed his mission, he'd be able to meet and have sex with her. But the final job was the most difficult so far.
Could you stab someone?
To terminate James Bell.
I haven't really thought about it.
His friend, John.
I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important.
The only record of what happened the following day is what the two boys told police. Nobody else will be able to corroborate it. – 11 a.m. Mark and John meet at Altrincham Station. Janet says she's planned the stabbing down to the last detail, even providing an abort code, 6969. If anyone mentions it, the mission is to be called off. Mark takes John to the Trafford Centre, where Janet has requested the stabbing take place. She's promised to be the first on the scene, posing as a detective superintendent to ensure Mark isn't arrested. He buys a kitchen knife, just as Janet has ordered, but tells John it's for his mother. After a few hours, Mark takes John back to Altrincham, having failed to complete his mission. Around 7 o'clock, 8 hours after they first met up, Mark and John are still together in the town centre. They wander into a quiet alleyway behind a row of shops. Mark takes care to avoid the CCTV cameras around the street that the Secret Service have warned him about. After 25 minutes alone in the alleyway, Mark takes out the knife.
I haven't really thought about it.
He drives it deep into John's stomach. As he does so, he tells John that he loves him. "20 minutes later, Mark calls for an ambulance. The police arrive within 6 minutes. Janet Dobinson isn't among them. After Mark's arrest, he was confronted with the CCTV footage and confessed to stabbing his friend John. But detectives were baffled. There appeared to be no motive, and despite being the perpetrator, Mark seemed genuinely disturbed by what had happened.
It was not something that was done without hesitation, nor was it something that was done without great upset. He was, as I say, clearly highly stressed when the authorities arrived.
While the police were full of questions, Mark only had one. When was Janet going to turn up?
He was, I believe, still satisfied after the stabbing that he would be vindicated ultimately by Janet Dobinson and her team in the fullness of time.
But Janet never came forward to exonerate Mark. After a month of waiting for her, with John still in intensive care, he finally told police why he'd stabbed his friend. He believed he'd been recruited over the internet by Janet Dobinson of the British Secret Service to murder John on behalf of the government. The police charged him with attempted murder and began their search for Janet Dobinson, who they believed was probably a paedophile. On Mark's computer, they recovered 6 months of chatroom text. Mark had attempted to delete it because he believed his mission to be top secret, but 58,000 lines remained hidden on his hard drive. From the stories in the text, they soon realized that virtual girlfriend Rachel, gay stalker Kevin, and spy mistress Janet Dobinson were obviously fake characters. Their exploits were simply too incredible, and apart from their chat, there was no evidence that they existed in real life. As police analysts dug deeper, they started to notice patterns in how these characters logged in and out. But it was the very words in their chat that became the most important clues. One word in particular was crucial. Every fake character had at some point misspelt it in exactly the same way. Instead of maybe, they all wrote my buy. So the police guessed that all the characters were in fact invented by the same person. Whoever it was, they had incited John's murder. So discovering their identity was key to solving the crime. But the final revelation was a shock to everyone working on the case. One real person in the chat room also made the same spelling error. 3 months after the stabbing, the police finally had a suspect. John. The victim of the crime, still recovering from his stab wounds, was arrested. In the face of the overwhelming evidence against him, he confessed immediately that all the characters who'd communicated with Mark had only existed in his mind. While the stories of virtual girlfriend Rachel and gay stalker Kevin were only tests of Mark's gullibility. Janet Dobinson was his ultimate creation. A character so alluring that Mark couldn't resist following her orders, even when it came to stabbing his best friend. John had created and administered the entire chat room. And on his computer, police found evidence that he'd faked 193 separate internet identities, even pretending to be real people, as well as his invented characters.
When I first met my client, I think perhaps I was expecting, what was I expecting? Perhaps somebody more evil than I found, because what I found was a frightened schoolboy, very likable, polite, modest, well-spoken, really a nice boy. You know, you would have been happy to have your kids play with him, is all I can tell you.
Mark, who was still being held in custody, was apparently ignorant of the fact that his friend John was behind the fantasies. He'd discover the truth for the first time in court.
I don't believe that Mark considered for one moment that John was responsible for any other emails or had any other persona other than the John he knew and whose company he enjoyed. And he was as surprised, if not more surprised than anyone, when the truth finally dawned that John had been many people other than the John that he believed him to be.
I think John was the puppet master, and he knew exactly what was true and what was false. And Mark, I'm afraid, was the puppet, and he was dancing to the strings being pulled by John.
On the one hand, John, clearly cunning, devious, intelligent, and with a death wish, juxtaposed with, on the other hand, a young man such as Mark, who was so gullible and naive as to become entrapped. By the time I saw Mark, he had, of course, then learned the reality of it, and was, I think, highly embarrassed about it by then, and certainly very upset that he'd been strung along like this.
But why did John choose Mark as his puppet? Why did he ingeniously maintain the elaborate deception for so long? And why did he eventually plot his own murder? "14-year-old John, the victim of a near-fatal stabbing, had in fact duped his unwitting 16-year-old friend Mark into carrying it out. But why?
To me, this is a unique combination of two very special personalities, and it was almost what we lawyers call folie à deux, when two people set off madness, one in the other. Either of these young men could go 1,000 years and never meet somebody who would set off this kind of behavior in the way that the other did.
Almost a year after the stabbing, in May 2004, the case came to court. Both boys pled guilty, Mark to attempted murder and John to inciting his own murder.
The charge against John of inciting his own murder is, in legal terms, unique. We looked up the books of precedents. We weren't even sure whether such a charge existed in law. But when we researched it with some care, we decided, yes, it was good in law, but we couldn't find another example. You know, in 35 years now at the criminal bar, and I've dealt with some very heavy characters, and I've had a very wide range of experience. But this is still a unique case. As the judge said, skilled writers of fiction could not have come up with this plot. It's extraordinary.
The Crown always took the view that of the two, John was the more culpable. He had quite consciously and deliberately involved Mark in behavior which Mark would not otherwise have contemplated in his wildest dreams. And our greatest anxiety was being able to persuade the court as to Mark's genuine belief in the veracity of the emails. A number of his actions would bear out the proposition that, so far as he's concerned, this was real. And I think the most telling of all is the final act of stabbing. And it seems to me quite extraordinary in those circumstances for anyone to suggest that he believed this simply to be a charade.
The court heard how what had started off as a game had developed into an unstoppable, all-consuming fantasy, which neither boy was able to give up. Though John had provided himself with an abort code to stop Mark from going through with the stabbing, even in the face of his own death, he couldn't bring himself to unravel the fantasy. And in Mark he'd found the perfect complement. A victim who became completely captivated by the stories John was writing.
Well, you know,